Before we analyze any literary text, so we'll call this the text here, before we analyze a text, we need to make sure that we take a step back and think a little bit about methodology. Which method are we going to use to analyze the text? We might assume that there's only one, but in fact there are lots of ways to approach a particular text and interpret it. In this video then, what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time thinking about this act of communication, about how we interpret the text, and we're just going to introduce very broadly the kind of field of literary theory. So what kind of critical approaches are out there, and most important of all, where do they focus? What is the focal point of different textual and critical approaches? Okay, so we're going to start here with a fairly basic kind of diagram. We have a text. We also have an author, typically, although it may be an anonymous text if we don't know who the author is. And then the author writes the text, maybe even performs it, and then we have the audience, you and me. Although we can, of course, also posit different audiences. We can talk about the initial audience, right? The people who first read the text, and later audiences, and maybe even imaginary audiences or hypothetical audiences or intended audiences. There are lots of different audiences we can talk about. So we see then that the author is trying to communicate something to the audience. And one of the critical ideas here is that this communication occurs over time, right? There's a time difference here. The audience might be in some kind of now moment, but the author is usually in the past. Even if the author is still alive and has written the text, yesterday and it just came out, there's still a time gap. And with time, usually with time comes change, okay, and some kind of difference. And this concept of difference is a really tricky one. In fact, there are some postmodern critics that have really investigated what difference means in terms of whether the text is still readable, whether the text can create its own meanings, or whether we need the author kind of present to be able to tell us what that text actually meant. So a lot of different questions come up then as soon as we start thinking about time. So we have this kind of fairly basic diagram, and the next question to consider then is, well, where are we going to focus? So if we think of ourselves as having this kind of, glass, this magnifying glass, kind of a crappy picture here, but you get the idea. Where are we going to put this magnifying glass? Should we focus on the text, on the author, on the audience? Well, different literary theories do one or more of those things. And so why don't we start with the text? What would it look like to start with the text? Well, a lot of theories that start with the text are referred to as formalist theories. Okay? They look at the form of the text. And one of the things that formalist theories like to do is actually suggest that the content, the message of the text, is related to the form. There's this wonderful kind of slogan, you might say, that form equals content. Form is important. And just to give one example, for instance, if you think about an epic text, right, a text that tells an epic story, then it wouldn't make sense to have a really short text to do that. If you had a haiku, for instance, a haiku is only 3 lines long. Can you think of a haiku as being epic? Well, no, because the form, the length of the poem in this case, does not match the content. We want something to be a little bit longer than that to be epic. That's just one example of where form really does matter. So we have quite a few formalist theories, and I'll give you a few examples here. And some of these are not necessarily always called formalist. But one way to approach the text is what's sometimes called new criticism. Okay, new criticism. And new criticism isn't new at all. In fact, the heyday of new criticism was in the mid-20th century. Okay, so the mid-20th century. And at that point, people were really saying that we should read the text by itself, in a sense. we should ignore or at least bracket the kind of historical social context and be able to see the text as an artifact that creates meaning through patterns, through contrasts. It creates a sense of unity. We can study its aesthetics, right? So aesthetics is the study of beauty, and we can really look at how the text has this sort of beauty all by itself. So we can look at metaphors and similes and all of those kinds of things to see how that works. New criticism has sort of fallen out of fashion in many ways because people say, well, we need to know more. We need to know about the historical context and all of these other things. But these days we still do what's called close reading. And I think maybe this is a way that we don't use the term new criticism anymore, but the effect is still there. And this movement, this literary theory kind of movement has taught us a tremendous amount about how to do a proper and meticulous close reading. There is some tension, however, between these kinds of close readings and, again, this more postmodern attitude. Because if we think about postmodernism, then postmodernism sort of actually challenges the idea that there's a unity to the text, and postmodernism suggests that maybe the text sometimes breaks down. Now, another thing to observe here as we look at the text is that texts are not written in isolation. We can really see that there are probably multiple texts that have some similarity, right? Well, it's going to get a bit messy, but if we think of this movement as having to do more with time, then the vertical movement has to do more with the similar text that we can find. Of course, some of these may be written earlier or later, but they have a lot of similarity. And so one thing we can do is called genre study. We can look at how this text fits in with other similar texts from the same or even different genres. We can also do a kind of structural, or a form of structuralism, so a structural analysis. And what that looks like is that we might look at particular patterns and structures that we find in this text that we can also see in other texts, or even in different parts of the same text. So to give one example here, let's say we're analyzing fairy tales, and we observe that a lot of these stories have a scene, a moment, that include a helper figure. Okay, every time we come across this scene where the main character needs some help, and then some helper figure comes in, whether it's a fairy godmother or somebody else who kind of helps out. Well, that's structuralism, right? That's actually seeing how these structures repeat themselves and create meaning. And so we're still really really focusing here on the text. Another way to approach the text is through something called narratology. This is getting messy, but we'll write it in here. Narratology. And narratology is not a huge field in literary theory, but I think it's a really interesting one. And narratology looks particularly at stories, how stories are put together. So stories often have common ways to kind of narrate events. They have a narrator, they have a point of view, they may have a climax, right? So if we look at the structure of stories, we call that narratology. And you can see now that all of these different approaches, many of them formalist or having paying some kind of attention to the form of the text, all of these approaches are really primarily focused on the text itself without having to zoom out too much. Although I should add that they're not exclusively focused on the text. And more these days, we find that people use multiple approaches. So they take the best of a number of different theories that apply to the text they're studying, and they move almost seamlessly back and forth between those different approaches. Okay, next we'll look at what it might look like to focus on the author more. So if we're going to focus on the author, then we can focus on the author specifically, and we call that, of course, biography, the writing of a person's life. And we can take all sorts of critical viewpoints to the author's life. One viewpoint might be something like psychology. We can do a psychoanalytic reading of the author's life, right? Did the author experience some trauma in his childhood? You could do a Freudian reading if you want, and you can apply that then to the production of the text. But even beyond that, very basically, you can talk about what actually caused the author to write the text, what was going on in his or her life. So we can focus on the author, but we can also zoom out a little bit and talk about the kind of social background of what was happening at the time. So we might call this social background or history. Okay, historical background. And if we think about that background, we could just study it straight up, you might say, and just look at what was going on. But we can also take a more theoretical approach. And these theoretical approaches that we have, there's quite a few of them, but I'm just going to mention a couple. Probably the one that's still very dominant and very influential, even though people might not call themselves this, is the Marxist approach. So some version of Marxism. You don't have to be a Marxist or a communist to do this kind of theoretical study of an author's background. But what Marxism typically tends to do is it tends to suggest that the text is some kind of product of the social background. Okay? And this raises all kinds of questions. It certainly raises questions about free will. So, does the author have free will? Or is the author constrained by the social and intellectual limitations of his time? That's a really profound question, and certainly something that's worth studying. A more specific kind of brand of Marxism that was very popular in the 1990s and still is today to some extent is called New Historicism. New Historicism. And you can look this up yourself if you like. But again, New Historicism really looked at how the text is influenced by historical things that we might not even be aware of. And New Historicism is somewhat Marxist, I would say, but it tends to have a more diffuse sense of power. So power is not necessarily, a form of propaganda of the ruling classes and so on, but power is channeled through society in ways that are even beyond people's control. And that creates these interesting tensions between different viewpoints, different ideas, and the text is a product of that. Okay, so again, we're looking at the social and cultural background, and we want to root the text in this kind of material sense of production, right? The real gritty background of the text. Those are just a few ways to think about the author, but we can also look at the audience. And you can see this is getting very messy. But if we look at the audience, one prominent approach is called reader response theory. Reader response. And what reader response theory suggests is that the meaning of the text is in many ways actually made up by the audience. Every audience reads the text differently, and so that meaning keeps changing, right? And that's why we should really study audiences, how different audiences react. Now, this is fairly new in a sense, this reader response theory, but more broadly, people have always talked about how audiences respond. If you think about Aristotle, for instance, Aristotle talked about this notion of catharsis. Catharsis. And catharsis is a kind of release, an emotional release or purification or purgation that happens when you go to see a play, let's say. You feel differently after you watch a play, right? You feel like that maybe some kind of emotional release has happened to you. And Aristotle called this catharsis. So there we're really focusing on audience reactions, and that can be an interesting kind of study in itself. All right. As you can see, literary theory is very messy because there are so many different approaches, and sometimes it's hard to know where to start. But my suggestion to you would be to be really eclectic in your approach. and try to find the approach, the theory that you find most useful for each particular text. And that can actually be different. So when you study one particular text, maybe the biography really matters. And for another text, maybe it doesn't, because you don't even know who the author is, or you can't be certain about who wrote this. So then maybe a closer reading might actually ignore the author. But I would, as much as possible, think about all of these theories as providing some kind of perspective that's valid and useful. And so the worst thing to do is to have your own pet theory. You just ignore every other theory and you always rigorously apply one theory because that's all you're interested in. Okay? And there are lots of other theories that we haven't even mentioned. So there's feminism, there is post-colonial studies, right? And there are lots of other theories that you can apply. But I hope at least that what this diagram has shown to you is that each theory tends to have its primary focus: author, text, or audience, and then we're always thinking about this movement in time. So one last point here then, the best kind of analyses, I think, are ones that focus, again, they focus on something, but they're always aware of what else is happening. And if we think about formalism, there's something now called the new formalism, as people try to update this. And the new formalism is really interested in, again, this concept of time. If we look at a genre, right, is that genre just a hypothetical construct, or is it something that's really historical, that's related to what was going on at the time? And that's a fascinating question. That's what makes this theoretical approach still so current. Okay, so now we know our basic idea of what methodology is. In the next video, as we keep looking at Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and this is the series that we're doing, we're going to talk more about a close reading. We're going to start with the text itself, analyzing it, and then over time we'll zoom out to some of these other parts of the picture.